Do men feel reluctant to show vulnerability with other men, especially heterosexual men? If they did that, they'd probably have better relationships with women. That was YouTuber's comment, and I think you're dead right, YouTuber. And that's why today I'm gonna take you through a walk through a man's world to show you why men have such struggles with vulnerability and what you as a woman can do to help us share. Hit the subscribe button with the little bell and I'll see you for the answers right after this. All right, before we get into today, don't forget my book has now been released. Make him yours, Beating the Odds of Modern Dating. All the secrets of beating modern dating so you can find the one for you. Check out the link in the description. 300 plus pages. It's very worth it. Today we're talking vulnerability. And why do all men seemingly have such a struggle to be vulnerable, not just with each other, with other heterosexual men, but with you in relationship? Well, to explain this, we need to go back in a man's world and look at where men come from. You see, men from a very young age, if we go right back to the beginning of men, where they come from, just 8 weeks after they're conceived, so they're still in uterus, just 8 weeks already, we're seeing differences between men and women. A man's brain between 8 weeks after conception, right through to 1 year of age, is already being flooded with testosterone. Now, testosterone, if you didn't know, is the hormone of dominance and aggression. It's the hormone of focus and goal orientation. And testosterone encourages competition more than it does cooperation. So when you're dealing with a man, you're dealing with someone even who, before they were born, had this flood of testosterone marinating their brain, changing some of those circuits to support these behaviors. Now, it's not only testosterone. There's a second hormone called MIS. Look this hormone up if you're interested. I find it fascinating. It's called Müllerian inhibiting substance. And what it does from 0 to 12 years of age, it defeminizes the brain and creates circuits for exploratory behavior, circuits for sexual interest and pursuit, basically circuits for play, aggression, exploration, and rough and tumble behaviors as well. And it's creating all these muscle circuits for that kind of activity. So you've got these two hormones acting in a man before he's even hit puberty. So these hormones up to 12 years of age are all having big effects on the minds of men. In fact, one of the effects that you might know if you're a mum is if you've ever wondered why male babies make a little less eye contact than female babies, they tend to follow moving objects more, that's the influence of MIS. And then as babies become boys, what we see is significantly more competitive behavior in boys than young girls. And not all of this is cultural. As I say, a big part of this is hormonal. Young boys will spend more than 2/3 of their time in games that are competitive in nature, compared to young girls who spend 2/3 of their time in games that are cooperative in nature. So why is all this important? And how does this affect vulnerability? Well, all of these hormones are prepping boys for a very important period. And that period is, of course, their teenage years. Now let's think about teenage years for a second. Take yourself into a teenage boy's world and think about that, right? Teenagers experience hierarchy. Girls experience hierarchy on a social level, as do boys. But boys create a social hierarchy in different ways than girls. A lot of boys' social hierarchy is built through physical dominance, physical aggression, competition, sports, mental abilities as well, and exploratory pursuing type behaviors. Right? That is how a boy raises up this hierarchy versus falls down. And the hierarchy is very important. The hierarchy gets you respect, it gets you attention from the girls, and it builds you up. It basically sets up your life as a boy. So boys enter this hierarchy phase and they get this dump of testosterone. You know, young boys actually have a little less testosterone than young girls. But when they hit this puberty phase, they get a 20-fold increase in their testosterone. And what does that do? It lights up the centers for aggression, for dominant-based behavior, for even seeing faces as more aggressive than what they are, for competition, again, more exploratory behavior. All of these circuits light up so that a boy can do well in this hierarchy. Now imagine you're a boy in this hierarchy. What's the number one enemy of physical performance? The number one enemy of being dominant or strong or competing? The number one enemy is in fact emotional weakness. And you see, the muscles of the face are all connected to the emotional centers in our brain. And so what they've found, what researchers have found, is that for boys to stay in this hierarchy, we need to learn to numb the muscles of our face to make them less reactive. Because in a world where hierarchy spots can change so frequently and where you've got to be so on, not just on yourself, but looking for weakness in others, seeing weakness in the face, seeing fear, that's an opportunity to make fun of someone and go up the hierarchy yourself, or get teased and fall down, right? So pretty quickly, even without the cultural additions, we've got boys who are learning that if I show emotions on my face, I go down the hierarchy. And the stoicism and men's love of hiding, being strong is born. That's where all of this begins, is men are training themselves for 5 to 8 years in these environments. Every man that you've ever known has spent 5 to 8 years learning, having subtle cues that emotions could seriously dip me down the male hierarchy. Now you might think, well, can't he just share his emotions with like a guy friend, a boyfriend at the time? And look, maybe if he was very lucky, he'd be able to do that behind closed doors. And that's where a lot of the most emotionally balanced men come from, is they do have that opportunity either with a friend and a parent to really have those emotions behind closed doors. But in most cases, weakness, showing it on the face as a teenage boy, that's going to make you enemies more than it's going to make you friends. Because everyone's looking for a chance to jump you in the social hierarchy, and weakness is that opportunity. So you must remember that boys, the men that you know, have all been trained in this hierarchy. They've even done studies, this is fascinating, they've even done studies where they show emotional pictures. They show emotional pictures to men and women. And they actually notice that there is a bigger response in the man's brain if you only show the picture for 0.2 of a second, very quick, 1/5 of a second, if you only show that picture. But men, even though they have a bigger reaction, that reaction dips almost immediately and you don't see it. Whereas women with their use of mirror neurons, much higher. Bottom line, even though men react, they've learned over time to bring that reaction down. Now, from a biological perspective, if you think about this, it makes a lot of sense, right? Young boys are more exploratory, they're more likely to take risks, they're more likely to push boundaries, and this makes a lot of sense because you don't want young girls doing that, right? It's kind of screwed up to say, but young girls are more valuable for a tribal society because they can bear children. So if someone's going to kill themselves, pushing limits, you want it to be the men, right? And this is how society expanded. This is how tribal society expanded, because more boys had these circuits for exploration and risk-taking. And it's why boys will typically push the limits of authority and society much harder as teenagers than girls. So what about then you as an adult? How do you help men with this problem? And how do you get guys to open up and be vulnerable with you after 5 to 8 years of training not to be? Well, the first thing you can do is if you have a boyfriend or a partner that opens up to you, make sure never to shame him for it. Hold space in that emotional display without judging, without expecting, and maybe without even speaking. Just hold space for him and support him in that, and make sure that you accept him for his emotions, that those emotions are okay for him to show you, those are loved, even the negative ones, and that those emotions and him sharing them actually make you respect him more as a man. Men have had a lot of training that emotions bring him down the masculine scale, so you've got to share with him how masculine you see him as when he does it with you. And second, I think it's important if you are a mum or if you know young men, because you might say, well, should we just encourage all young men to share their emotions all the time? And look, we have to be pragmatic here. Boys are built this way. Boys are built to establish their pecking order. No one has one before that age, so we're not going to get rid of this behavior entirely. But what you can do, I believe, is encourage boys to access their emotions when appropriate. So rather than telling teenage men, hey, never use your emotions, emotions make you weak, we tell them that, hey, there is a time to focus and put your emotions aside, to get the job done and be a man. But there's also times to come back to those emotions, to feel them, to embrace them. And the more you do that, the more you get the timing right between when to feel those emotions, go into them, and when you put them aside. That's what makes a real balanced man. Far too often, men see emotions as a blanket weakness. So we need to change that mindset, not by saying follow your emotions all the time, but by encouraging men to find the balance and knowing that having those parts of themselves and making time to access them at the right time is very important, not just for being a man and being successful, but for being strong around women too. So that's the video. And I hope that shares with you why men have struggles with vulnerability, why they hide their emotions on their face, and gives you a little more understanding as to how to relate to them.